Welcome to Campfire Academy. I'm Andrew Craissati. Today we're talking about humanizing the shareholder update.
So why does hearing directly from the CEO matter to investors?
I often get asked, why does a CEO need to get involved in investor relations? Why do investors want to hear from a CEO and not just from someone else in the organization? Well, at a simple human level, the CEO is where the buck stops. This is the person who is the senior most ranking executive in the company, and investors want to talk to that person. They want to hear what they have to say. They want to be able to proverbially look them in the eye and get a good feel for them. So there's a human aspect to wanting to engage with the CEO directly. Now, with that comes a real challenge, which is how does a CEO get his or her voice heard by maybe thousands or tens of thousands of investors? So finding tools that introduce efficiency into that process, such as Campfire, is really important so that his or her voice and face can be seen and heard with efficiency and irrespective of the scale of the audience. The CEO, in my view, sets the tone for the company. The CEO is the authenticity, is the face of integrity. They are the front of the company. And so everybody really wants to engage with that person and not simply rely on their lieutenants.
How do tone and authenticity influence how investors interpret the company updates?
So when you think about the tone, the voice, or the authenticity of a company as conveyed by its relevant IR professionals or the CEO, that influences how investors react. On the one hand, investors react off financial information and the written word. So they might read the prospectus for a public company. They will read the quarterly or annual results, whether in the annual report or in whatever statutory documents are supplied throughout the financial year. But there is then what isn't said in that document. And what isn't said is something that needs to be captured. The written word typically does not convey tone, does not convey authenticity. Now, this becomes particularly important when a company is in crisis or a company is in a critical moment. Perhaps, for example, the board is arguing in favor of a merger with another company. The company is assessing the need to improve an offer that it's made to buy a business. The company has been sued by a third party and with some significance to that litigation. These are all moments where the nuance of communications becomes really important. It's not just what you say, it's how you say it and how you are believed that really matters. So a consistent approach to tone, voice, and authenticity effectively deliver your integrity across to your audience. And that integrity, if it's well executed, extends beyond just you as the CEO, and it becomes an umbrella that wraps around the organization itself. So getting the tone right, getting the authenticity right, means that you're picking up all the nuances that you want your audience to share and influencing how the investor therefore interprets the information that you're providing them with.
What makes an effective human shareholder message, and what crosses the line into over-personalisation?
When you think about creating messages for your shareholders, there is an element of humanizing whatever that content may be. Another way of thinking about it is, how do you make it feel more personal? The CEO of an organization is often someone who is impacted by an event that is being discussed. the employees of the organization may be impacted by that event. The CEO's ability to convey the impact felt by employees is extremely important. Maybe, for example, the company has a workforce that is unionized, and through a strike that is taking place, the union members who are employees are perhaps suffering financially as a result of the strike. How the CEO talks about that becomes critical. Is the CEO antagonistic? Does the CEO view the employees with disdain? Does he or she show a lack of empathy for their issue? These are areas where a lack of humanity in what the CEO says will backfire, potentially very significantly. Showing the right level of empathy will mean that the investor is more likely to be somewhat aligned with the views of the CEO and the organization. But this can go too far. If the CEO is overly intimate, talks too much about the personalization of the issue, then the investor can start to reflect on, well, who is the CEO looking after here? Is the CEO looking after my interests as a shareholder in the company? Or is the CEO looking after the interests of the employees who are striking against the company? So while it's fair that I'm probably giving a slightly dramatic example, the truth is that that's a story that can apply in many different circumstances. Another issue that's important to understand with the personalization of messaging is if there has been a disaster or there is some form of crisis. How the CEO finds the right blend between showing empathy for victims or those who have been impacted and a message of we need to get on with the problem at hand, solve it, and move on with our lives. These are very tricky moments. Think, for example, of the crisis that Boeing has been in for a number of years now, with having significant crash incidents with some of its aircraft. How it navigates that moment of the CEO being empathetic to the loss of life and the damage caused by these accidents, while at the same time trying to manage the process of liability and litigation must be extraordinarily complex. But finding that right blend so that there is integrity and authenticity coming from the CEO will then allow the investor community to understand that here is an organization that is socially astute, morally astute, but at the same time is still being intelligent in how it runs its own business and how it manages the crisis that it finds itself in the middle of.
What misconceptions might executives have about humanizing their communications?
So when you start thinking about what is humanizing a communication, one of the first things that comes to mind is what misconceptions do we all have about engaging in this practice, particularly an executive in a public company or a quoted investment trust. I think many people worry that humanizing a communication means either that they are flaunting the laws and they are somehow abusing the regulatory structure of how a public company talks to its audience, or they might be thinking that this is just too relaxed and public companies shouldn't be talking in this way, that the corporate voice of an organization should somehow be non-human or impersonal. I think that's not true. An organization is made up of human beings, and it is by its very nature able to talk as if a person. It can have feelings, it can have a point of view, and it very much cares about attributes such as integrity or authenticity or honesty or transparency. So humanizing a communication, as long as it is done responsibly and intelligently, it will in all likelihood enhance the quality of the investor relations by introducing a dynamic that is simply impossible to deliver through a PDF Word document or a statutory announcement. Something that requires more storytelling will bring to light the nuances and the context to that communication. So executives shouldn't worry about humanizing a story. Far from it. A fund manager, particularly certain categories of fund managers today, will appreciate that there is an element of the narrative which is still corporate in nature, but with a tone that is more human or more empathetic as a result. I think it's also worth understanding that communications, if they have a more human dynamic to them, often bring your product to life. I had an experience recently with an Indian bank that was talking to us about investor relations in India. And they are in the business of taking deposits from customers, but they're also in the business of making loans. And their loans are not just large multi-million-dollar loans to big multinational organizations doing business in India. They are also micro-sized loans to the local entrepreneur in a village somewhere in rural India. Bringing that story of a micro loan in a village in India, bringing that story to life, explaining how that loan enhanced the village, allowed a building to be built, allowed the introduction of cellular phone coverage in that village. Whatever that story may be, the humanizing of it then is applied to the brand of that bank and allows that bank to be much more than an institutional lender. It is an organization that is enabling wonderful stories about its customers and very positive, socially astute and morally beneficial evolution within the country.
Can you share an example of when a CEO's voice changed investor sentiment or clarity?
Let's look at how CEOs can actually impact sentiment, or clarity for that matter. An interesting couple of case studies. There was a young man called Steve Jobs who founded a company called Apple Computers, arguably one of the most dynamic CEOs, at least in a generation. This was a man who, when he spoke, he influenced. He influenced the world, not merely his own shareholder sentiment. He was able to bring to life the power of the computer, the power of the mobile phone. He did so much more than just promote a computer. He was promoting what that computer meant to society and how it was going to be used by every human being in society. So his voice changed sentiment. His voice reinvented how the world perceived a particular product, the computer, or more recently, the iPhone and the iPad. So I think that's a great example where the voice of a CEO creates profound change. Interestingly, there's been some recent developments at the BBC that have been well documented as I tell this story, where the BBC, as a very trusted organization, has been accused of a lot of wrongdoing, particularly by the US government and the president in particular. And in that wrongdoing, the CEO, who in the case of the BBC is referred to as the Director General, spoke up almost immediately and he apologized for the wrongdoing. And he did two things that were extremely impactful. One was that he was apologetic about the mistake that the BBC had made in its wrongdoing. But equally, he was extremely vocal in defending the work of the BBC and reminding the world that the BBC has been around for over 100 years and that in all surveys, it typically ranks in the top 3 news brands anywhere in the world as being the most trusted news brand. So even as he chose to resign his position in the last few days, he has at the same time arguably changed sentiment and created a lot of clarity around the very difficult position that the BBC has put itself in, and he's been working hard to fix that before his departure from the organisation.
How do you strike a balance between candor and compliance?
So let's talk a bit about our CEO in our theoretical scenario of a public enterprise and the balance that that individual has to find between how they speak with candor and how they speak based upon the advice of their lawyers and their bankers. Lawyers and bankers have a tendency to drive decision-making that is fear-based, liability-based. How do I avoid opening myself up to a lawsuit? How do I ensure that I don't mislead the market by perhaps overly emphasizing our future prospects and how wonderful they are? So your advisors, for the most part, are a voice of caution and reason. You, on the other hand, have your own role, which is to speak as the chief executive. And that means you need to sometimes be candid, and you need to frame your words so that the difficulty of what you're talking about comes through, and comes through with the right balance of cautiousness but transparency, or candor, as I say. So it could be, for example, that you wish to have a discussion on the role of artificial intelligence within your organization, a highly topical subject matter for the time being. You might wish to be candid and say that this is going to result in the loss of jobs, that in fact your workforce will reduce by 20% as a result of the introduction of AI in your organization. Are you going to be candid? Will you disclose that number and quote a 20% drop in workforce? Or will you take a more cautious approach and rely upon the advice of your team around you? The candor with which you speak will allow you to then decide precisely where you sit between arguably these two extreme ends of the spectrum, between candor and compliance. In all likelihood, you will find a middle ground. You will find a way to let your voice of integrity and authenticity come through, talking about how AI is a positive attribute that will benefit the company, but by which it will not come without challenges. And how those challenges are ones that you are going to have to face in the future, and that may include the loss of employment by some of your workforce, etc. In most cases, finding that balance is actually within you. It isn't necessarily something where you need an abundance of advisors to teach you how to find it. We all largely know how to find that comfortable middle ground between two extremes. And this is an area where you should listen to the lawyer teaching you what keeps you compliant with applicable law, but you should also be listening to your gut that tells you precisely how to be a candid, high integrity and authentic chief executive.
And lastly, what should listeners be asking themselves as they put some of these insights into practice?
So today's discussion is a really interesting one because the CEO is ultimately the person responsible for the narrative of the company. You are the person who designs the narrative, albeit with the support of your leadership team, and you are the person who executes it by meeting with your key investors, by communicating with your shareholder base, by attending your annual general meeting. These are all moments where you directly are the face of the company and the voice of the company. So it's key that you take away from today, don't shirk away from that responsibility. Embrace it. It is a terribly important part of your role. Delegate by all means, but every moment when you delegate, remind yourself that it is still your voice that is being delivered, albeit by other people on your behalf. You are in control of the message. It's your face, it's your voice, and you are the ultimate responsible person. Don't ever lose sight of that. And remember that your company is a human story that needs to be told creatively. This has been Campfire Academy, an Audi production. To learn more about how you can capture investor attention and stay top of mind, visit audi.com.